One of the most consistent and silly tropes in science fiction is where one or two ships pull up in orbit over a comparatively primitive world and subjugate it with just a few thousand soldiers. Conversely, it is also immersion breaking when big bad scary aliens invade only to be repulsed by American Marines who can somehow go toe-to-toe with aliens despite the fact that the invaders are bigger, stronger, and have superior tech. Both of these genre-busting tropes have the same thing in common: a misunderstanding of force multipliers. Technology, while critically important for an army, is not the end-all be-all of war. Conversely, there is no situation where a technological advantage is meaningless. History is replete with examples of both these situations. For instance, the decades-long slog the US had to deal with in Afghanistan. Not only was the technological disparity between the Americans and Taliban extreme, but so were troop levels. Neither factor was decisive. Strategically, technology is simply a force multiplier, just like the high ground or home field advantage. Your technology may be extremely advanced compared to your opponent, giving you something like a 20x advantage, but that still means if the enemy brings 40 people to the fight, you're probably going to lose. Now, here is where we get into a little math. There are just under 8 billion humans at the moment. China alone currently has an estimated 2 million soldiers when you combine active duty, reserve, and paramilitary. India has 5 million, and the United States has 2.2. Russia has 3.5, and these percentages aren't abnormal unless you're in Europe, and that is only because they benefit from the US umbrella through NATO. I think it would be very safe to say that 1 out of every 7 people would be capable and willing to fight an alien invader. Just imagine that for a moment. 1 billion savage, angry barbarians with home field advantage. It doesn't matter how much of a technological edge you have, you aren't going to beat that with a few Star Destroyers worth of stormtroopers and aerial support. Humans are mean, nasty, and downright dirty fighters, and we simply have no way of knowing how our ferocity will stack up against aliens. For context, I recommend you Google "Humans are space orcs." It is both informative and funny. It is possible that an invader would default to space-to-ground bombardment and pound our civilization into the dust, but I would argue that an invader would either do that immediately or not at all. Orbital bombardment is so devastating, it wouldn't leave anything to conquer, which is fine if you came for raw materials, but counterproductive if you came for conquest. You just destroyed everything you came for, rendering the threat of orbital bombardment partially meaningless. I would argue that you don't invade a planet for its raw resources, you invade for conquest. Very few of the reasons a species would conquer a planet are what we would consider moral. You could consider the inhabitants of a planet tasty, or you could want slaves. You may not even need slaves, but just want them for the feeling of power. You might for some reason need the infrastructure on the planet or the ecosystem. The point is, you don't invade a planet for raw materials. For that, you can just park yourself in the high orbitals and fire railgun darts at the planet until it is an uninhabitable moonscape. No sane resource-centric attacker would waste time, resources, and manpower to conquer a planet for iron and gold when they could just mine one of trillions of rocks they don't have to fight for. There has to be a compelling reason to land troops before you would risk so much machinery and so many people. This may seem heartless, but so is conquering a planet to strip it of materials. That would be worse, in my opinion, because the native inhabitants would slowly die in misery. The reality is that it is extremely unlikely that a spacefaring civilization is going to invade an inhabited world for raw resources, when there are so many uninhabited balls of raw materials floating in space. It would take even a Stage 2 civilization generations to strip a single Mars-like rock ball for its raw materials, and there are so many stars with so many planets that it makes no logical sense to invade an inhabited world for raw materials. It doesn't matter if you're talking about iron, cobalt, whatever. There are more readily accessible materials out there that you don't have to fight for. That means that if somebody is invading you, they're doing it for a far more nefarious reason than resources. It is more likely that they are invading because we are in the Goldilocks zone, which is where it isn't too hot and isn't too cold and liquid water can exist. This means they aren't coming for raw materials, but to set up shop, live, and possibly terraform our world into something more like their home world. In my opinion, that is far more terrifying than strip mining nomad conquerors. Generally, an attacker would need 2 to 3 times the number and firepower as a defender if they want any hope of success. Even if aliens had vast technological advantage, giving them a 20 to 1 kill to death ratio, it would take a minimum of 50 billion troops to take Earth. I personally think that is a daunting number even for an interstellar empire. So basically, if aliens exist, it is unlikely they would be interested in invading Earth. Even if they wanted to, it would still be costly despite a technological advantage. If we are ever invaded, it will probably be long after first contact and for some political dispute other than basic needs like raw materials or patently evil motivations like slaving despots. Please like and subscribe. My social media links are in the description, as well as links to my books.